Hello, everybody, and welcome to Covering the Aftermath, Teacher Shortages in Special Education. My name is Savannah Trines-Fernandez of AL.com, and I will be moderating today. Before we get started, I want to go over a couple of ground rules. A quick reminder that everything is on the record. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, a request for clarification, more details, links, just drop your questions in the chat box and we'll get to them in the last 15 minutes. We'll have roughly 45 minutes today with our panelists, a 45-minute discussion before Q&A, and I'd like to thank them all for sharing their time and expertise with us. The goal of the session is to help journalists build trust with students and their families who use special education services, as well as to know where to go for public records, find out more about the national network of advocates who exist, and learn about what accountability means when covering this topic. We're following up on a webinar from late last year that discussed the topic of teacher vacancies, how this is a national labor issue, how journalists can unpack the topic so it centers teachers and families, and how special educators in particular carry an invisible burden for filling in where there are gaps, not to mention the impact on families who are in turn dealing with unmet needs and unfulfilled resources. This webinar will look into special education, but unfortunately, we are not joined by any teachers, mostly because it's a school day, and also likely because of the pressures already in place. However, we are joined by advocate Edison McDonald of the ARC of Nebraska, audio journalist Lee Gaines of WFYI, who has covered special education, and two parents, one of whom isn't here right now, but she will be joining us shortly, Darylyn Morrow and Carmen Rojas, both of whom have children with individualized education plans. So thank you all so much for being with us today. And with that, let's get started. Edison, if we could start with you. As a reminder, Edison is the executive director of the ARC of Nebraska, the state's chapter of the national organization that works to support people with intellectual and physical disabilities. So Edison, maybe if we can just start with the basics, can you define special education for us, specifically who qualifies and what are the spectrum of services that are available?
Yeah. So when we're talking about special education, we're talking about anybody who falls under IDEA who needs extra increased supports. So that can have a really broad range in terms of who that will include. You definitely will think about folks with, Down syndrome and autism, but even some of those, other disabilities, you can still have supports there. Do you want me to kind of go over kind of a broader scope and talk a little bit about the issue?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Well, I think really, the most important thing to remember here is kind of the core. We've started to see a huge increase in restraint, seclusion issues, where we have kids who are pushed out of schools, shifted to other schools when they don't want to be. They are being we call it school push out, where even though they're not formally suspended or removed, they'll still go and say, hey, mom, dad, Jack's not doing so well today. So can you come pick him up? We don't want to have a suspension on his record, which of course then exacerbates the problem because then we don't have data to be able to actually track it. And we don't actually see, oh, hey, he's really getting pushed out of classes. And I think really the course of so much of this comes down to two big issues. One is funding, and then the second one is just our overall staffing crisis. In terms of funding, special education has been radically underfunded since the beginning. And that has really just kind of had this long-term continuous problem where we've had shortages. And typically in most states, special education is the highest shortage out of every department, even higher than STEM. And because of those long-term shortages, we've had a system that's kind of cobbled together and just barely able to support itself. Well, we knew that we were going to have a big shift within our system when COVID came, when we started to lose a whole bunch of folks out of the workforce. But COVID was a catalyst, and instead of that happening over 20 years, happened over 6 months, a year. So as we're trying to figure out how to deal with these issues that were supposed to be longer term, all of a sudden have been compacted. Now we have to deal with that huge shortage. And that really can be really significant. So like here in Nebraska, in Omaha Public Schools, they have 50.2% of their special education positions are vacant, which is just gigantic.
Yeah.
I mean, and how can you function in a school when you've got those sorts of shortages? I think a lot of the other numbers I'm seeing are a lot lower, but still significant, typically in that like 19, 20 something percentage range of vacancies. But that really puts a lot of pressure on folks. And it's hard because, you know, part of that really comes down to that funding. We have so much of that funding where we started off and we really, you know, we were already short. But as we've seen that exacerbation, we've seen the impacts of inflation, we're seeing more and more folks who are struggling, folks who are saying, I'm going to take an early retirement, I'm going to go to another job, I'm going to go to an area where there isn't as much pressure. And then those well-intentioned teachers who are saying, I'm going to go to another area where there's going to be less pressure, then it continues to grow the problem and it continues to get worse for well-meaning teachers who are trying to do their jobs. And so, you know, really what ends up happening is that you have, you know, your state funding, which is short. And because of that, then your school board is going to struggle and your administration is going to struggle to figure out how can we do this on such a hamstrung budget. And then because we have those shortages, then it ends up putting teachers into these precarious places where then we see a lot of these issues start to really kind of peak up more. We see increased restraint because if you've got a classroom with too many kids and you can't support them, and then one kid goes and, you know, tries to bolt off down the hall, it's harder to go and take that time to work on those de-escalation tactics to really kind of, you know, prevent the issue because you've got way too many other kids you're focused on. So then what happens? You go for, you know, something that's going to be, you know, more aggressive. And that's where you have some of those really horrible cases of restraint. And we've had some really just horrific ones. I've seen kids who have come home and you can see the finger marks of an adult on their arm. And I've even seen those with finger marks on their neck. And that's what happens when we create this pressured cooker system. It really just significantly escalates what's going to happen. And then, you know, I think the other big piece is not just talking about teachers, but also talking about paras and other support staff. And I think that's especially where I'm hearing there are even more issues because paras aren't going to have that same level of training as teachers. And because the pay is so low, they have huge vacancies too. And they're just turning over anybody who they can get into those positions. When those folks aren't trained, they aren't supported, we don't have a good infrastructure, we're basically just asking for problems. And that is the special education crisis that we're seeing now.
Yeah. And when you're working with families at ARC,
Yeah.
what is some of the support that they're asking for from you? And what are some of the common difficulties you're navigating?
Yeah. So, you know, I think for, you know, the supports they want are just to make sure that their kid can get a good quality education, that they have the support that they need at school, that they have the access to services that they need. And then from us, you know, typically as they're asking for those, and those are things that they do have that right to under IDEA and FAPE. But what's happening is that they are getting pushed out, and a lot of times it's off the books. As I said, you know, in that case of the student who, you know, they're like, well, we don't want to officially say that they're suspended. What that really means is they want to keep it off of any sort of paperwork, so it doesn't create any sort of negative paper trail for them if a court case comes up down the line, or if somebody is investigating the more systematic stuff. And teachers feel it too. administrators pressure them to not write things down, to not report things. And that creates a really difficult environment where you don't have that data, you don't have that trust, and it decays trust between teachers and administrators, and it decays trust of families. And families of kids with disabilities have to struggle through so much already. I already tell, kind of say, not even just within special education, but the life of a kid with a disability, the likelihood that you're going to have to pursue legal action just to get your basic rights is pretty significant throughout their lifetime, whether that's dealing with Medicaid or access to education or, civil rights, whatever it may be. There are a lot of really difficult barriers, and a lot of times you do have to get legal counsel involved, and legal counsel is not cheap. So that really makes it difficult for families. So then, even if you have the funds to have an attorney, that doesn't mean that there are enough attorneys who really specialize in special education law who have that knowledge. So I think that's another barrier. But the biggest one, and I think the biggest one that y'all will be dealing with, is that families are scared of school districts, and for good reason. There are a lot of school districts that really take on some more aggressive tactics, and it leaves families feeling like they can't trust, they can't have a conversation with the administration. And I think especially a lot of administration has really shifted to depending on their lawyers because they're afraid of litigation. So I think as you work on building the sources of parents, and I'm really excited to hear more from the parents who are on here. That's really hard to go and make sure that you can actually get those stories shared. And a lot of times I'll have parents who will tell me stories, but they're scared to go public with those stories. They're scared to go and pursue a legal case. They're scared to go and file a Department of Education complaint or a Department of Justice complaint.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for journalists given, no paper trail, as you mentioned, when there are push outs, given that there is a fear of retaliation? How do we get these stories?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are some data sources you can look at. The Office of Civil Rights out of the Department of Justice does have some data on this, and they do investigate cases. Depending on your state, and I'm not as familiar with other states, but here in Nebraska, we've got our State Board of Education, and we have complaints there that we can look at. Some states I know have started to go and work on getting some sort of specific source where they're tracking all sorts of disciplinary data. So those are good places to go to at least look for data. But then in terms of building stories, I'm probably biased, but organizations like the ARC are your best friends. We have those stories. We've built that trust. And, families know that we're going to be there. They know that we're going to protect their confidentiality. They know that we're going to have their back. But it really does just take that time to go and build the relationship. And I think especially just walking families through and talking about things and saying like, especially as you're talking what's on the record versus what's off the record, and really focusing more on just starting by getting that background of the stuff off the record, until you can kind of help to guide them through to share that story, because otherwise it can have negative implications for that individual because targeting is real. Doesn't happen every time. A lot of folks I think have really worked to avoid that, but it happens. And so I always advise families, most families want to see the system change, not just for their kid, but for all kids. And I advise families, think about your own kid first. We'll focus on the system and only really go after those if you're really comfortable, and if you really feel like you're in a spot where you can go and pursue that. And that really varies. I think especially if they are looking at pursuing legal action, most attorneys will advise them not to talk to reporters at all, which is a good idea. But I think it's just It's building that trust and being very, very careful with that source.
Yeah. So, Darylyn, I want to transition over to you now. I saw you nodding along when Edison was explaining the big picture problems that we're seeing in special education right now. If you could just give us some insight into what the experience has been like for you in making sure that your children's needs are being met.
Well, I have two boys. One is in fourth grade. He has autism, and my first grader, he has IEP, but it's listed as other.
Okay.
Mm, I was nodding because he was talking about the teacher shortages, the para shortages, and all the problems that it creates inside of the school system, especially for special education. I've worked as a para. As of right now, I'm a behavioral tech with ABA, and I've been seeing a lot of, I've been seeing from my perspective, I've been seeing a lot of teachers leave and go into something like ABA, as well as I've seen this past summer, my son, my fourth grader, his school, right before school started, they had only maybe two teachers in the whole building. They had maybe, I want to say less than half of pairs. Even as of right now, they have less than half of pairs in their school. And so I've seen the difficulties that the teachers are having, and I've seen the hardships that make it for those children because they're not getting a quality education. Like as of right now, my son's school, they don't go to lunch. They have the para bring the lunch to the classroom because they don't have enough support. They're not doing like their arts and music or library time because they don't have anyone to fill those positions. And so for, I hate to compare it, but as compared to my first grader who's in a regular gen ed setting, he's getting a full elementary education, but my fourth grader, he's not. I've also seen, like, as of right now, my son's teacher, she's already said, she's told them she's not coming back next year.
Mm.
She doesn't have enough support. So
And,
that's why I was shaking my head, because a lot of the educational aspects, I really agree with it.
and what's that impact? What's that impact been on your sons and your family when you don't have those teachers in place?
It's been very hard. My son, he's been having some like transitional issues, like with transitions, and he's become a runner.
Mm.
And my other son, he's doing better, but at the same time, he's not having the support that he needs for, like, he's gifted. Like, and so he's not getting that kind of support educational wise because of the setting that he's in. And they've had to, for my fourth grader, they've had to, because he was having he was pretty much having a meltdown in the classroom, and because she only has one para and they should have four in that room. She's had to call the principal. She's had to call the in-house police officer to come in to kind of, help diffuse the escalation. So it's been very hard, and I'm trying. I'm in a position where I'm like, I don't know what my options are right now.
Yeah. So if a journalist approached you about writing a story about special education in your school district, what would you want to hear from them to know that they understand the topic, and some stories or directions you would point them to?
Um, as far as like stories and things like that, I would point them to the district. Um, I would point them to the issues that are going on at the schools. I would like to have the trust that what is said is not going to be misconstrued into something else, that they understand exactly what's going on, because a lot of these kids, they don't have advocacy, and they're kind of just pretty much being left behind. And so I feel like, as a reporter, I feel like getting that story out there, it creates more people knowing what's going on. It could possibly add, it could possibly promote change for these kids that really need it. And I feel like, because even as a parent, and I know other parents with children with special needs, they're frustrated. They're extremely frustrated because they go into the schools, they either don't know who to talk to, they're looking for transparency, they're not getting it, and they're also looking for things to be done in a timely manner, and that's not happening at all. And so I feel like accountability, as far like after that article gets out, follow up. What changes happen? How are these districts, how are these school corporations and directors at the school, the principals at the school, how are they fixing what the issue is? And to be able to fix the issue without it blowing up into something as if we're not talking to you anymore. Because a lot of parents, they become afraid to continue to try to talk to those higher ups, because they may have created this issue where now we have to go sue the school, or now we have to go try to get some type of arbitration, and that person becomes a pariah.
Yeah. So part of accountability, if I'm hearing you correctly, is for us journalists is making sure that we stay with the story. It's not just one and done. We're following up. We're continuing to see where the process is leading.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else in terms of accountability that, would it be important to you to see from a journalist in the stories that they're putting out?
If they can, like with the follow-up, or if like a parent comes with a concern and they see that it's a major concern, that maybe that they can make another story or make another article or something that gets those words out. If like, let's say, like the teacher shortages, if parents find out or get that information about those teacher shortages, and they're not getting the information that they need, that they can feel confident enough to go to a reporter, and that reporter is able to investigate that situation and get some more information out.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would want to see a reporter do that would make you feel more comfortable talking with them, especially as it relates to these retaliation concerns that both you and Edison have brought up?
As far as because a lot of people don't want to talk to reporters because they feel like they're going to be hounded about this information, and they're scared of when this information comes out, what's going to happen. I feel like a reporter should give them a feeling that's not like kind of a friendly feeling, and be more show empathy, show understanding, and just kind of give them as much information that they know possible to help ease and gain trust and gain feeling of safety, that this is a safe place where I can talk to you.
Yeah, thank you. So with that, Lee, I think this is a great place to ask you, you're reporting on special education. What's really struck me about it is just how many voices you have in there, from families to teachers to administrators. How do you source those stories and get, them to be so many different perspectives in them?
Thanks for that question. And I also just want to thank Darylyn for, being a source of mine, and just for being so open with your family's story. And I've really appreciated, everything that you've shared with us, because it's informed our reporting, and we're going to continue to report on that particular special education system. But in terms of sourcing, I'm always trying to think about, at the end of the day, who is most impacted by this, and it's students. And sometimes if you've got a student on the autism spectrum who perhaps doesn't speak, then you need to talk to their parents. You need to talk to the people that are at the heart of this, who are really feeling the brunt of it and are also the most vulnerable. And sometimes you can actually talk to the students. I think one of the most exciting things for me is to get voices like that onto NPR airwaves, because those are voices that we don't typically hear. So I would say that finding the teachers and finding the families, that's probably the most challenging sources for journalists to find. Folks like Edison at the ARC in Nebraska, or the ARC of Indiana has been a crucial source for me throughout all of my reporting. Kim Dodson over there has been great. They're pretty ready and willing to talk with you. Same with experts at the national level. Disability Rights Network is another really good source, especially for the legal stuff. I would also encourage everyone to talk to attorneys who represent parents in special education disputes. I can say for Indiana, there's not that many of them. So they're, and I think a lot of times they're not even used to being talked to by reporters, because my opinion is that special education is an undercovered issue under the umbrella of education. So thinking about, like, who are all the people, who are the categories of people that are impacted by whatever story that it is you're trying to tell, and don't give up. I think the way that I found Darylyn actually was going through board documents, and I was trying to talk to para educators, so paraprofessionals who had resigned or who had left this particular district. And I saw Darylyn's name, and I was able to find her on social media. And then it turns out that Darylyn is also a parent and has 2 children in that district. And so that was, going through board documents. My co-reporter on this story, Dylan Piers-McCoy, is excellent with data, excellent with FOIA. She requested teacher licensing data, so we could look at, what kind of licenses people held, if they were on, provisional or emergency permits, or if they were fully qualified educators, and trying to talk to both of those individuals. And through looking at that licensing data, we could also see, by comparing it to a more recent year, like who had left. So we were trying to track down people who had left, and you can do that. Social media is your best friend in that regard. So like I said, a lot of it comes down to just being really diligent and really persistent. And I want to acknowledge that that is not always easy. I'm an investigative reporter now, and what that means is I have the privilege of time. And when I was not an investigative reporter and I had more daily responsibilities, it was hard to fit that persistence in. But I really do think at the end of the day, it's worth it. It's going to make your stories so much better and so much more compelling, and hopefully more impactful, so that we can hopefully change the system and the lives of the folks who are impacted by this for the better.
Yeah, you brought up special education being an undercovered issue, and I'm curious if you had to kind of make a case to your editors about covering a topic where, you can make, where you hear from a lot of people, but it's just like the minority of students. It's not a math class that every student has to take, or it's not a reading class that every student has to take. How did you, if you did have to navigate any pushback, how did you kind of make your case there?
Luckily, I have an editor in a newsroom who was 100% behind my push for special education. But I think part of the reason that they were supportive of it is because I made the case that during the pandemic, this was a group of students who were especially impacted, because a lot of things that happen in a special education classroom don't really translate to an online learning environment. Like, for example, trying to provide speech language services via Zoom, that doesn't always work out so well. So I knew that as much as students in the general education population were impacted by the pandemic and virtual learning, I knew that that was probably even more severe for this category of students. And I also think you could make the case to your editors that, like, look, do you see anyone else covering this? Like, this is an opportunity for us to make our mark, for us to break stories, for us to, get really impactful reporting out there. And we really don't have much competition. There's very few other people in the state of Indiana, for example, that are covering special education specifically. And that's kind of great in some ways that you don't have a lot of competition. In other ways, it's terrible because there's so many stories. I wish I could clone myself.
Yeah. And, you've done at least one 2-part series on teacher shortages affecting special education. And one story, a parent finds out there's no teacher in her daughter's classroom, just a teacher's aide. And you're reporting, how common is that?
That's the school that Darylyn's 4th grader attends. That school it's a school that's for kids with disabilities specifically, both developmental and emotional disabilities. That is a particularly egregious example of the shortage, I think. As Darylyn said, they still have terrible staffing issues. But that issue of lacking a teacher, I think has begun to become more pervasive. And it might not be that your classroom doesn't have a teacher at all, but they might have a teacher who's on a provisional license. So it could be someone who's brand new to special education and they're still working through the credentialing process. And I don't want to knock those teachers because everyone has to start somewhere. But if they don't have the support that they need in the room with them or from the administration, then you are kind of setting them up to fail. So it's not just a question of like, does my kid have a teacher? It's what kind of teacher do they have? And if maybe even, worst case scenario than someone who's on a provisional license could be a long-term substitute. So that's someone who isn't qualified for the job and is also not even receiving the education that they need to be qualified for the job.
Yeah. And how do you go about finding these gaps?
That is a great question. So Edison mentioned complaints and due process decisions. Actually, I don't think you did mention due process decisions, but you did mention complaints. So complaints is actually what led me to start investigating the system that Darylyn's kids attend, because they had more complaints lodged against them than any other special education system in the entire state of Indiana. So that was a really big red flag. And that ended up being, fruitful for us as reporters. There's also due process decisions. Now, depending on the state that you live in, there might be very few of those. I know in Indiana, most due process decisions end up getting settled before they go to the hearing stage. And I do want to mention this just to talk about some of the barriers that parents can face when coming to reporters. If they were in a due process dispute and they ended up settling, oftentimes what I found in my reporting is schools will ask them to sign non-disclosure agreements. And so they might face a penalty, like a monetary penalty, if the school finds out that they talked about the services that their kids received or the dispute at hand between them and the district. We did do a story about those disputes, and we ended up anonymizing our source to protect her from any legal repercussions. But aside from those two places, I also think looking at your teacher credential data, something that Dylan and I found earlier on in our reporting was this rise in the number of emergency permits issued for teachers in special education. And so what that indicated to us was that there was a decrease, or they weren't finding enough qualified teachers to fill these positions. States also have job banks. Indiana has a job bank where you can find out all the available jobs. It's not the most reliable source of data, but it is a source of data. So it can give you a sense of, where are the shortages most acute? Because it's not just special education teachers. We're also talking about paraprofessionals, and we're talking about speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, school psychologists, physical therapists. All of these people are crucial to making special education work well. So those are sources of data. Edison brought up seclusion and restraint. Now you can get aggregated data on that, or you should be able to from your state, and you can even go to a particular school district and request that data. You might have to file a Freedom of Information request to get it, but I still think it's worth getting. You're not going to get students' names, hopefully, if they're following FERPA, but it is another window into like what's happening in special education classrooms. And then in terms of, trying to confirm and like bulletproof your story, hopefully the parents that you talk to will be willing to share some of their documents. So that could be their child's individualized education program. So you can see what they're entitled to compared to what they're actually getting in school, or communications that they've had with the district. That's been really helpful in terms of fact checking some of the things that parents have told me, because oftentimes the district will use FERPA as an excuse not to confirm it, or they just won't answer you at all. I've had that situation a number of times. So your parent, if you've built that trust with them, they will really be a crucial source of not just the story, but also some of this information that backs up what they're saying, because there's a lot of paperwork in special ed.
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you. Edison, I want to ask your advice on this. As I began covering special education, I was very intimidated by just how technical and complex it can be. I think that for journalists can be like the first barrier that you have to overcome when dealing with this topic. Do you have any advice for journalists about like how to break down those complexities, or just some basic things that we need to understand before covering special education?
Yeah, I'd say there are a number of really great trainings that can help to crash course you through stuff. On our website, we actually have a training we recently did on kind of that school push out sort of side and effect. We were talking more broadly, but also talked some about kind of the current crisis portion. And the ARC of the US actually has an excellent training that really kind of crash courses through that quickly. I think the two biggest areas are just, figuring out and being able to understand when you're, looking at those complaints and those due process complaints. I think those are really, that's a big piece. Understanding, kind of the impacts of restraint and seclusion, which there are a number of resources that can really help you to kind of get caught up on that very quickly. And I think the other thing is school funding, and really understanding that school funding and then how your special education is funded. So like here in Nebraska, because property taxes are such a heavy portion of our school funding, and especially when it comes to how kids with disabilities are funded, it really is a lot of that property tax side. It leads to very different impacts on like rural districts versus our larger urban districts. So I'd say those are kind of the key pieces to kind of crash course through, and a couple of those resources that I'd recommend.
Yeah. Darylyn, I wonder if you have any advice as a parent who's had to navigate this system, of how you've kind of broken it down to better understand what you're entitled to, and what services are in place for you.
For me, it was because I'm gonna be honest, when I found out about my son's diagnosis, they basically we went to Indianapolis. They pretty much gave us a sheet of paper and said, good luck. So it was kind of like, okay, what do I do from here? I personally made it my mission to get to know people that are at his school, to get to know to find out who's in the district, who's the directors, I joined the PTO at the school. So I kind of put myself inside so I can kind of have an idea of this is what's going on. And so for me, when I find something that's like, okay, this isn't right, even if it isn't my kid or it's my kid, but it affects the other kid, I'm willing to, hey, we need to fix this. We need to do something about this. So I've gathered a network on Facebook. It's called the Parent Advocates of Porter County. I created a Facebook group at parents if they wanted to join the group. So if we have some issues, we can talk about this or we can get it out there. So that way we can create a parent network of parents that are on the spectrum, or not just the spectrum, but other special disabilities. And also for me, navigating it is finding out who I talk to. If I don't know, keep asking questions until I can get those answers.
Yeah.
Two things I want to tag in on. One, those social media groups are great. Parents of kids with disabilities have so many Facebook groups that really can be great sources of information and can really provide a lot of great stuff. Sometimes, again, though, I will caution, we're seeing more school administrators and staff in those groups. And so sometimes it makes it hard to have kind of those more confidential conversations, and that's always the danger of social media. The other thing is the special ed directors. I would especially suggest talking to the state special ed director because I think individual districts will be more likely to want to kind of cover up things and say, oh no, our district's doing fine, it's all good. But I think you'll get a little more of an honest assessment from the state, who's like, oh, hey, okay, we see kind of the bigger picture and we're not worried about just one individual school. We're not trying to cover up things. We're just trying to make sure that we're providing quality education well across the state.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. And in the last 2 minutes we have before opening it up to a Q&A, I'd want to ask each of you if you could just share any suggestions you have, maybe on a story idea, a public record we should be requesting, or maybe people we should be talking to. Edison, you want to start that off?
I mean, yeah, I already said that State Board of Ed director. I think that's an excellent source. I think also, you know, those organizations, I can't say how invaluable they can be, whether it's the ARC or the Down Syndrome Alliance or the autism groups, or, you know, if you those sorts of organizations, we can really help to just be that connector, be that funnel, give you kind of that background and crash course through stuff really quickly and connect you with those families. And if they don't have them offhand, then they have the relationships to go and quickly get them for you.
Great. Lee, you have any suggestions for us?
Well, one that I thought about just now is that this is complicated. It's hard. It's challenging work to do. What has really helped me is teaming up with another reporter to do the work. She's on maternity leave right now, and I've already felt her absence in doing this reporting. And when she gets back, we're going to continue and hopefully publish a big series. But I cannot say enough about how helpful it has been to have another person on the team with me doing this work in addition to our editor. So if you're not lucky enough to have another education reporter in your newsroom, maybe you have a health reporter, because this also touches on a lot of health issues, children with disabilities, there's medical needs involved, things like that. I highly encourage you trying to team up in order to tackle this. And then the other thing I would recommend is try to understand the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That's IDEA or IDEA. And then our state, Indiana, has its own kind of set of rules in addition to IDEA. It's called Article 7. Your state probably has something. I don't know what it's called in Nebraska, Edison, but I'm sure they have something like that. So try to understand the law so that when you're listening to parents and you're talking to them and they're telling you something, you might, you know, in that conversation, identify a violation of that law because they're not getting something that they need. So those are my two big suggestions. Try to understand the law and try to find someone else who's down to help you with this reporting.
Yeah. Darylyn, any suggestions from you, story ideas, things we should be looking at, people we should be talking to?
For story ideas or even like people that you should be talking to, I honestly say when you're talking to the parent and they have guess you can say they have a grievance with whatever is going on in that situation, ask if they're okay with sharing that documentation. Because sometimes if you can share that documentation, you can end up finding other things that may have not been mentioned, and it may create a bigger avenue for you, or a different, another, what's the word I'm looking for? Another side road to take with it. And also, with the parents, like Lee said, knowing the laws and knowing Article 7. A lot of parents don't know their rights that they had when they're able to with the IEPs and even the 504s, and knowing having some knowledge of that can help the parent as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you, all three of you. I think we're going to open it up now to audience Q&A. People want to put their questions in chat.
Yes, we are getting some questions submitted in the chat. Thank you everyone for participating. Savannah for moderating, I really appreciate it. We are getting some audience questions here, which I will go ahead and ask. The first is from, and I'm CD Davidson Hires with EWA. The first is from Kelsey Kendall. They're asking what kinds of documentation could be helpful in covering this topic. Additionally, are there any technical terms or jargon we should be aware of? I believe that each one of you have mentioned reports or avenues for documentation. And I think that if you have anything even more specific, like the name of the document itself, that would be helpful to know. But let's start with technical terms or jargon we should be aware of. Let's see, Darylyn, I mean, for you, what was receiving your child's diagnosis, what instantly shifted?
Can you say that one more time?
Sure. I was just going to start with you in terms of technical terms or jargon that journalists could be aware of. I thought that similar to you receiving your child's diagnosis, there might be a similarity in what may have changed for you in terms of getting used to
some technical terms that I needed to know, like what was a case conference committee? What is IDEA? What is FATE? I had to find out if because a lot of times it'll be like, does your child have a secondary diagnosis? But sometimes they do. Finding out exactly what that secondary diagnosis was for my son. And good jargon is to kind of BAs, because you're gonna, especially if you come across a IEP where kids are having behavior issues, or they're having some, or they're like maybe wanting to try to transition out of that school into a different school, they might say you need a FBA, which is a functional behavior analysis, and to create a BIP, which is a behavioral intervention plan. So knowing those things and knowing how it works, that would be really good to help the reporter as well as the parents.
Well, it's one of those acronym-rich environments, it seems like. Lee, do you want to add anything jargon-wise? Actually, pardon me, Lee, Savannah, as you were moderating the whole thing, but you also are covering this topic, is there anything jargon-wise that you encountered when starting off on this? And then Lee, I will ask you the same thing quickly.
I think that there are just a lot of laws that bind special education. And like Lee said, if you can familiarize yourself with the laws, it will really help you understand as a parent is talking about, this is what my kid is entitled to, this is what they need. I think also if you can get a parent to share an IEP with you or as much documentation as possible, that kind of just breaks down, this is what someone needs and this is why they need it. But it is, like I mentioned, it is a very technical realm that sometimes you just have to kind of my process is writing down everything, trying to break it down to make it as consumable as possible, and then checking with my colleagues who also cover special education, being like, is this right? Is this the right word I should be using, or is this the correct like legal law that applies to this? So as many eyes as you can get on your work, I think is helpful in special education.
Mhm. Lee, any final add you want to make? I see that you answered one question on here that you avoid the phrase special need as it's considered offensive in your reporting. And I wanted to say that out loud to the group so that the webinar could hear that as well. But is there anything else you would like to add?
In terms of acronyms, it's an acronym-rich environment for sure. I think FAPE is the big one that Darylyn covered a lot of it, but the only ones I'd add would be LRE, least restrictive environment, and also TOR, teacher of record. I see both of those acronyms in IEPs and documents a lot, and I was like, what is that? The first time I encountered it. So that's what that means. And then in that answer, I sent a link to the National Center on Disability and Journalism it's from the Walter Cronkite School. They have a style guide for what language to use around this. I have a little bit of an issue with their style guide because the AP apparently recommends to avoid using the term special education and be more specific about the services. That's not very helpful guidance when you're talking about the special education system at large. You might have noticed, though, that there has been some schools, districts have transitioned to exceptional students or exceptional learners, exceptional, superintendent of exceptional student services. That's just a rebranding of special education that I've noticed beginning to take hold.
Our next question, Lee, is actually directed to you from Liz Schlimmer. Can you talk about how you navigated the Office of Civil Rights database? I should use my glasses when I'm reading things. What are the red flags that you're looking for, and how did you identify or find broader trends here?
Hey, Liz, I hate the OCR. I hate it. It's not reliable. It's awful to use. I hope that in some future, somewhere down the line, someone does like a huge overhaul of that database. In order to use it, I actually got someone named Harold Jordan. He's with the ACLU. I was interested in discipline data for a while, and he actually walked me through how to find the data for the districts that I was looking at. But when I was in Illinois doing a story using OCR, I was comparing it to the data that was kept by school districts, and it didn't match at all. That's what I mean when I say that data is really difficult to use. Unfortunately, it's the only source of national data when it comes to looking at like special education and discipline measures. So if you want to put your state or your community in the context of the national realm, that's really the only data that's there. It's really difficult to use. I would say a better, maybe more reliable source of data is to go to your Department of Education, depending on what you're trying to track. If you're interested in that discipline stuff, they should be tracking special education, suspensions in school, out of school, expulsions, things like that. And you could also do that comparison maybe with your state data and the OCR, and you'll probably find a lot of inconsistencies there. In terms of red flags, I mean, I think everyone should be looking at the rate of discipline of students with disabilities, the rate of arrest of students with disabilities. This is something that's been covered before, but it hasn't been covered enough, I think. I think it's worth continuing to look at.
That has to do with Darylyn was saying that following the story is the most helpful aspect to covering this as well. From Susie Glassman, we have just a note that some districts are heavy-handed with their non-disclosure agreements. Settlements won't show on the state complaint list or due process list, but you can make an open records request for the total number of complaints filed against the district so that you can get a sense of whether there is a systemic issue within your district or state. Let's see. Jessica Votica Our school district, Grand Island Public, has several different elementary and middle school campuses. I have indications 2 elementary buildings in particular are struggling. Does anyone have any advice for lasering in on these specific 2? I will open that up to the group.
I'll tag in first. Jessica, you and I should definitely talk after this. And my Grand Island chapter director, I bet we can find some information and find some good inside sources there. In terms of the data, you can go and ask the district for that broader data, but you can also use those state complaints to look back and at least get some sort of broader picture. But I think probably it's going to be those individual stories that are really going to help to amplify it.
From Jesse Gomez, what are key things we should FOIA our state or school district for? I'm going to amend this just slightly, just ask the 2 journalists here to begin with. If you have used a public records request in your reporting on this topic this past year, what was one specific one that was useful? Lee.
I mean, luckily, I don't know if this is luckily or not, but our person at the DOE, like our press person, often would just give us data. We didn't have to FOIA for it. I think she wanted to avoid FOIAs because they had to go through some extra legal process. I have FOIA'd when the few times that she's refused to give me information. But I would FOIA for that discipline data if your state tracks it. And then if your state isn't tracking it, or if because I don't think every state tracks arrests, for example, that might be a story in and of itself, what the state has or doesn't have. I think the suggestion about requesting all of the number of complaints filed against a district, like you could ask for the number of complaints filed against districts for a certain school year compared to the number of complaints that were investigated and actually produced some kind of investigative report. That would be interesting to see, how many of these complaints are being looked into in a very thorough way or just being dismissed. Those are the 2 big ones. And then I would this is really basic, but just get an understanding of your enrollment. Is there been an increase in the number of students with disabilities in your state, in your district? Maybe there's been an increase in the number of students with IEPs, and at the same time, there's been a decrease in the number of qualified teachers available to provide them the education that they're entitled to.
Savannah, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Really echoing Lee there. I think if you have a relationship with the Department of Education, special education head, sometimes for me at least, I've been able to go directly to them and say like, hey, can you give me numbers on teacher vacancies, things like that, enrollment numbers, things like that. And then just in addition to discipline, I think seclusion and restraint records right now over periods of time would be very useful for a lot of journalists and would have a lot there.
We have a few more questions, and I'm mindful that we will be going over time just a few minutes, which I appreciate everyone sticking around for that. Darylyn, I wanted to ask you a kind of reframe of that question, which is you had mentioned earlier offering, the reports or the IEPs to journalists, like if journalists have that rapport with a parent. How could a journalist, this has also been asked of you, but how could a journalist approach you when they're not receiving information and they're having a hard time getting that information from a district? How could a journalist approach you in a way where you would feel comfortable sharing that IEP information with them? And I'm kind of putting Lee in a little bit of a spotlight here because I know she did approach you, but I'm interested.
For me to talk to Lee in the first place, it was she approached me and she said, hey, we can talk off the record unless you feel comfortable talking on record. We talked off record a little bit at first, and then we spoke on record. And by developing a kind of relationship where I could see there was real concern about what was going on, and seeing that hey, this could possibly really be something and help out. felt more comfortable talking to her. And over time, as we communicated about the issues that are going on in my district, I felt more comfortable telling her more things that were happening. And when it came to documentation and I had it, I was able to give it to her because I felt more comfortable because it wasn't just a one-time conversation.
The follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
We have 2 more questions. Mariah Ballingett. I was interested to know about what is happening when schools simply can't find special education teachers to work for them. Can they just hire anyone who matches their minimum requirements for other teaching positions? Also, is there a federal law that requires special education teachers and providers be credentialed?
I can take this. This is like the subject of, maybe I'll just like put this story in the chat. The story I did for NPR just basically spelled out all of this. So there is a law under IDEA. There are requirements for special educators. They are supposed to be fully licensed as special educators. But when schools can't find them, because that's been the case in many places, the federal law does have, I don't want to call it a loophole, but like a squishy gray area that allows them to hire people who aren't fully qualified as long as they're actively pursuing their certification. So something that when we were trying to look for solutions to the special ed teacher shortage, we saw a lot of districts doing like grow your own programs where they'll hire someone who will be working on their special education credentials at a local university. The district will cover their tuition to get that credential. And then maybe there's like a caveat where that person has to work a certain number of years in the district. So that's something that a lot of districts are doing. And I would encourage people, it's something I didn't say, look for solutions to the shortage. This is a big one that I see happening around the country, and ask those districts how successful they've been retaining those people who've gone through that grow your own type program. But I think that there are a number of schools that are just completely violating IDEA when it comes to staffing their special education classrooms. I think they're putting paraprofessionals in charge. I think they're putting substitutes in charge. I know that that's happening in the district where Darylyn's children are. And that is a violation of IDEA. And something that Dylan and I, something that got us started on this whole thing was we found out that Indiana as a state had been violating IDEA for years by putting special education teachers on emergency permits. So that means that they weren't qualified and they also weren't pursuing qualification. So that's like in a nutshell. It took me a really long time to figure this out. That's why I'm really excited for the question and the opportunity to answer it.
Yeah, no, thank you. We have one more question, and before I ask it, I want to mention that this webinar has been a follow-up to a teacher shortages, teacher vacancies webinar that we hosted late last year now. But that also included an advocate on special education joining us. And one thing that was mentioned during that webinar in terms of being able to grasp the level of work that goes into these resources or maintaining these resources post-pandemic is asking teachers and asking parents also to simply map out their schedule specifically related to education for a week. So that would cover, leaving work to attend to something that's happening at school, or for teachers, the amount of work that they take home with them on the weekends. And that could be a possible story idea for just explaining what isn't documented. So I wanted to offer that into this webinar as well. So our last question, which I had in front of me just a moment ago, Juliana Allen. Do state departments of education have a vested interest in stopping reporters from finding out information about complaints against the district, specifically about student maltreatment? And I see that Edison and Lee have both answered that, but do you want to say this out loud to the whole group? Lee or Edison?
I'll let Edison take it.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
It was the one that you just answered from Juliana Allen about how.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, there's definitely a vested interest, I'd say, from state boards of ed, at least some, but the much bigger one is those specific individual schools and specific districts. They are so much more defensive and aggressive, but I think the state board, and I don't know about other states, here we have what's called educational service units. So they go and help to support all the schools with some of those extra services. They're great sources of information and far more willing to talk with you more openly. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I want to say thank you again to our panelists and our moderator for joining us today. Thank you to everyone in attendance. Finally, just visit ewa.org/events to sign up for upcoming online and in-person events, and keep an eye out for when this webinar will be posted along with a transcript. And I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you. Bye, everyone.